Welcome back. Today I wanted to do essentially a longer review of the novel The Passenger, which I reviewed last week. I gave it an amazing review on my Instagram channel. And unfortunately, I just felt that trying to review that book in 3-4 minutes was just too limiting. And I had like 12,000 different things that I wanted to share about this book because it's still with me. It's still stuck in my head. And it's an absolutely incredible novel. The gist of the review was that this was an incredibly powerful, intense novel, which was incredibly surprising given that the author, Cormac McCarthy, is now 89 years old. He's one of the most prolific American writers of the last 40, 50 years even. And he has produced some real masterpieces in the past. The books that I've read by him are The Road, which was a journey across post-apocalyptic America. It wasn't quite clear what the apocalypse was, but it was the journey of a father and son across a very bleak landscape, a post-apocalyptic landscape, and it contained all sorts of horror, but it was incredibly powerful, an incredibly strong and insightful commentary on what it means to be human, good and bad. And that was really cool. And then this summer, when I was driving across the US, when I was driving across states like Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, I wanted to read something that was relevant to that region of the US, and read his novel Blood Meridian, which was written, I think, in the mid-'80s, and is a Western, which is really the core of Cormac McCarthy's writing soul. It's his, I think, core genre. Even if some of his books are not necessarily set in a Western setting, and don't feature cowboys and outlaws and that kind of thing, it is, I think, the fundamental genre for him because it contains, it encapsulates really his viewpoint as to human nature, the duality of human nature. I don't know, but it basically, one could surmise that all of Cormac McCarthy's books are fundamentally Westerns. And many of you may disagree with this. But anyway, that's the beginning of my rant. Brief intro into Cormac McCarthy. In recent years, he has moved to the city of Santa Fe in New Mexico, predominantly because it brings him closer to a center called the Santa Fe Institute, which, as I understand it, is a research center / think tank that gathers some of the finest thinking minds, scientific minds in physics, maths, and really this is a place where people spend a lot of time thinking about the future, about humanity, about deep sciences. And so Cormac McCarthy is connected. I'm not sure if he's a fellow there or if he just hangs out with the people who work there or whatever, but he's connected to it. And I think this shows in his latest book, where there is a big connection to physics, to science in general, and there's a lot of discussion around very deep topics. I apologize in advance if this is not very structured. I'm going to zig and zag in a ton of different directions, and I'm just going to allow myself to rant, and then different ideas will connect to different things. But all in all, it'll be a fun trip through this novel and some interpretation of it, if an interpretation is even possible or advisable but I will do my best. Let's start this rant. I think the first thing, yes, it's so powerful. The second thing is, it is a book that goes in so many different directions and creates so many different vibes that wouldn't necessarily be connected, and it's not clear why they would be connected, except in the mind of someone who looks at these different vibes and thinks, it would be pretty cool to connect this universe and that thinking to this sort of environment, and so let's do it. And so this is why in my review I said this felt a little bit like the Swan Song. This felt like an author thinking, I'm just gonna have the best time and I'm gonna connect things that have no business being connected, if only because it's fun and it's cool to connect them. And this is something I love in literature. This is when I get a real kick out of a book, is when I feel the author's having fun and trying to do something different and new, and it's gonna be cool, whatever happens, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense. So what am I talking about these vibes? What specific vibes am I talking about? Well, first of all, let's go through the story of the main character, who's a salvage diver called Bobby Western. And so again, that connects to Cormac McCarthy's love of Westerns. And I think, again, this is sort of a reference, a tip of the hat to his writing career, and saying, hey, yeah, I'm all about Westerns, and I'm not afraid to say it. My guy's called Western today. So cool, Bobby Western, he's a salvage diver. Interestingly, he's not located in the Southwest, which is Cormac McCarthy's territory, let's say. He's not in Arizona or New Mexico or Texas. He is located in New Orleans, which has an entire vibe of its own as a noir city, a city of, I don't know, what can we say? There's always something dodgy going on in New Orleans. One might say it sort of oozes loose morals, maybe. It's on the Mississippi. There's something flowing about the city. You know, one immediately thinks of Anne Rice and her books on vampires around New Orleans. One thinks of Tennessee Williams and A Streetcar Named Desire. There's something sweaty in that environment, something a bit noir. I'm thinking also of movies like, what movies am I thinking of? Cat People, I think, with Malcolm McDowell and Natasha Kinski. That was like an early 80s movie set in New Orleans. There was also that Brian De Palma movie from the mid-70s called Obsession that also took place in New Orleans, and also connected to a completely different vibe in Italy. So New Orleans is the heart, but also not the heart of this book. I love this. So it's a great location, and there are scenes in New Orleans where he meets, where Bobby Western, the main character, meets associates of his, friends of his, people he deals with in bars, and they order drinks that sound like Southern drinks, and it's another kind of noir vibe, and I just love it, and I think it's so cool. And so the setting's amazing. You're in a Western, but it's also in the Gulf of Mexico, so I absolutely loved it. Bobby Western is a salvage diver, but he has a really interesting past. He is the son of a nuclear research scientist who worked on the atomic bomb on Project Manhattan in the mid-40s during the war. And so this led him to study physics at Caltech, which is a leading scientific university in California. And so there are conversations where Bobby Western will have a conversation with someone, and it's not quite clear who this person is, about nuclear physics, about quantum physics, about stuff that you cannot conceivably understand. and it's just thrown out there. And, you know, at one minute, this guy's a salvage diver and he's under the water and everything. And then he's having a conversation on string theory and all sorts of crazy scientific concepts. And it's really cool. And I didn't understand any of it, but it was still really cool. And it felt like, you know, Cormac McCarthy just wanted to shoot the shit about physics. And he was like, I'd like to write a passage about quantum physics, and here I go. And if you don't like it, tough beans. And so I really like that. There's that whole vibe around physics, around the dad being this nuclear scientist, around the development of the atomic bomb. Quick side note then on the atomic bomb, with regard to violence in Cormac McCarthy. So this is a book that features the atomic bomb as a very background character. I mean, it's evoked several times during the book that the father worked on this project. There is a beautiful, beautiful passage on the detonation of the atomic bomb in Japan, of one of the atomic bombs in Japan at the end of World War II, where the prose is just incredible in terms of the violence that is unleashed and the way this violence is described. It's sort of the pinnacle, the summit of violence. This is the ultimate violent weapon of civilization. And so Cormac McCarthy is climbing to the top of this summit. And yes, in the past we've had in Blood Meridian, we had outlaws doing horrific things to each other. We had in the novel The Road, horrific post-apocalyptic human behavior that was just gruesome and horrible and culminating in terrible things. And here he dives into this ultimate weapon, this ultimate violence, and he writes about it just magnificently. I actually want to read from that passage because it's just so stunning. I could read from a ton of passages, but I chose this one because it is the ultimate violence, and I think the poetry that he expresses in that passage is one of many examples of the poetry that he's expressed throughout the book. So here's the passage where Cormac McCarthy describes the detonation of the nuclear bomb in Hiroshima. Those who survived would often remember these horrors with a certain aesthetic to them. In that mycoidal phantom blooming in the dawn like an evil lotus, and in the melting of solids not heretofore known to do so, stood a truth that would silence poetry 1,000 years. Like some sea thing, wobbling slightly on the near horizon. Then the unspeakable noise. They saw birds in the dawn sky ignite and explode soundlessly and fall in long arcs earthward like burning party favors. I mean, I think any author writing just one paragraph like that in their career would be very happy. Violence also in the sense of, I've always thought of Cormac McCarthy as having a fundamental Hobbesian view of humanity. What do I mean by that? I'm referring to the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who was a 17th century English philosopher, best known for his work called Leviathan, where he argued essentially that the natural state of affairs in humanity was anarchy, right? That we were just gonna, if we were left to our own devices, we would basically all murder and steal from each other, and it would just be awful. So you need a central system, a Leviathan, a government, which can help coordinate, regulate human activity in a peaceful way, right? And the core of that theory of that book is that men lead lives that are basically nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, so this is really what Hobbes views, that we're basically animals. We live in anarchy, and we live in a state of almost permanent violence. And to prevent that state of almost permanent violence, we have to basically create these institutions, these structures, these social structures to help protect and to create and protect society. So I've always thought of Cormac McCarthy as having that point of view. In Blood Meridian, you're basically at the frontier of civilization. You've got these outlaws and they're badasses, and they're basically behaving as if there is no law and beyond. And so in The Road, same thing. All sort of any sort of government, any sort of law has been obliterated, and so you get back to a state of affairs like that. So in my limited experience of Cormac McCarthy's literature, I always thought to myself, he's got a point of view that probably connects somewhere to Thomas Hobbes. And of course, in this book, which to me was another signal that this is like, I'm out of here, guys. This is my last one. And I just wanted to confirm to you guys that I really think in Hobbesian terms. He has his character read Thomas Hobbes's book, Leviathan. So to me, that was like a really great reference that, yes, this is where we are. We are talking about Leviathan. So this is a salvage diver who reads philosophy, who's got a degree in nuclear physics, who's the son of one of the leading creators of the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, and so on. What other vibes does Cormac McCarthy decide to throw in there? He used to be, hold on to your asses, he used to be a race car driver in Formula 2. And so he was driving races in Europe and was basically just a very fast car driver who now drives a sports car. And so this whole novel is set in 1980. Of course, the sports car that he's driving is a Maserati Bora, which looks like the coolest car. And I just love the fact that it's not a Ferrari, it's not a Porsche, it's not something too obvious. It's something really researched and cool. And the way that Bobby Western, through his scientific background, through his race car driving background, understands engineering, and specifically automotive engineering, is just amazing. And again, he dives deep into what makes the car great. And there's a whole section on where he describes his racing career and how that worked and how he went about it. And I absolutely loved it. And I loved the freedom that Cormac McCarthy gave himself, just to say, wouldn't it be cool if this guy, aside from being a salvage diver, James Bond style, also had a degree in nuclear physics? And while we're at it, we're going to make him a race car driver. And while we're at it, we're going to make sure he drives a really cool car around this cool city of New Orleans. So everything's like really well put together. So I loved all of that. I love this freedom. Now, all of this liberty and this fun is balanced out by a very tragic dimension, which is at the heart of the novel, which is that Bobby Western has a sister called Alicia, and part of the novel is told from her perspective, and it is a very sad perspective because she is mentally ill. She is paranoid schizophrenic. And so there are large segments, entire chapters, in fact, that focus on her illness and are written from her point of view inside her head and what it is that is happening inside her head. Basically, her illness is manifested in the fact that she is visited by a cast of characters, a cast of oddballs that are led by a very sinister, very villainous, manipulative, monstrous, but at the same time slightly pathetic character called the Kid. And more specifically, he is nicknamed the Thalidomide Kid. What a Thalidomide Kid refers to is a very painful, tragic event in history when there was a pharmaceutical company that was prescribing this drug called thalidomide, and they had not warned pregnant women that this drug was not at all advised for pregnant women. And so women who took thalidomide during their pregnancy gave birth to babies that had malformations of limbs, specifically in the arms, I believe. I'm not an expert. But so there was a certain number of women who gave birth to babies who had these malformations. So Cormac McCarthy, the incarnation of the paranoid schizophrenic illness, the leader of the gang that is visiting this patient in her head, has such a malformation and is described in these terms. Is described as being particularly short, and instead of having hands, has what are described as flippers. And he is described as a kind of grand priest of the whole proceedings of her illness, and he wheels out different characters at different times to project trauma, to question her reality, to fuck with her head, basically. And he's a manipulative, passive-aggressive, horrible guy. He's constantly getting her name wrong and calling her a wrong name. It's super disrespectful, and their relationship is very unclear. And we'll look at that in a minute, because this forms the basis of the companion novel, which I haven't mentioned so far in this video, called STELLA. And so the character of the sister and her illness actually forms the basis of the companion novel. This is really an absolutely phenomenal portrayal of, I thought, of mental illness, of paranoid schizophrenia. It's a terrible illness, and the way it's presented, mostly tragically, but also with a degree of humor in it. There's a moment, for example, when Alicia, is going to have electroconvulsive therapy, so shock therapy, which at some point in the 70s was thought to be a good idea to treat mental illness. She is treated with electroshock therapy, and when the kid, this mental gang leader, reappears in her hallucinations, his hair is all fried, his face is all black. And so there's sort of that amusing touch to it as well. But overall, it is a very tragic thing. Even more of a spoiler is that the relationship between Alicia and her brother is thought to be possibly incestuous, even though they have never consummated their love. And that is only made clear when you really read the companion piece. But it is really a story at its heart, a love story between a brother and a sister, and the sister romantically loves her brother, is in love with her brother, and the brother does not love his sister romantically, but loves her very, very deeply nonetheless. And so it's a tale of sibling love that is incredibly touching in that dimension. So what is this book about? Well, the book opens with Bobby Western and another diver. They are diving through the wreck of a plane that has recently, very recently, sunk off the coast of Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico. And they're in this sunken wreckage. And after they come up for air and they're debriefing about what they just saw on this very recent plane wreckage, they realize that they think that somebody's been there before them. Somebody has had time to come in and interfere with this wreck and remove the black box of the wreck. And they believe that one of the passengers on that plane is missing. Maybe the body's been missing. Maybe this passenger escaped or survived or whatever. And here the story begins. And so, spoiler alert, actually, the story does begin in this way, but this is a bit of a red herring, and it actually goes nowhere. And Cormac McCarthy is just like, yeah, I mentioned a plane, and yes, there are going to be strange men who may or may not be following Bobby Western. They do question him at some point, and they are probably FBI, but are they or aren't they? They have IDs, but who knows? and they are surveilling Bobby Western or not. People come to his house, so he has to move. But essentially, what Cormac McCarthy wants to do with this wreckage is to set up a situation where Bobby Western is on the run from the government, who has made up some sort of excuse that he owes back taxes or something. So he's on the run and he needs to get off grid, and he's going to be talking to a detective in New Orleans who is, part of that whole noir vibe of New Orleans I was talking about earlier. And so it's an amazing setup, and you have to let go of the fact that the plane is not going to go anywhere. And a lot of stories, a lot of elements here don't go anywhere, or don't go where you think they're going to go, and they just get dropped. And he just wrote about this plane because he wanted to write about a plane that sank in the Gulf of Mexico, and how cool is that? And he wanted to write about people diving in this wreckage, and how cool is that? And so there's that whole vibe, and it allows him to create a real Kafka vibe. And I think that's really super interesting. Like, is the government after him? And in a way, then that connects to his sister's mental illness of, is there paranoid schizophrenia? Is he paranoid schizophrenic and the government are after him? And maybe he's the passenger in the plane, metaphorically, that he's going through this trip that he's not really in control of. And so he goes on the lam. He has to go on the lam. The government are after him, and he has to go off grid. And so he does. He goes off grid. And that connected me to an amazing book that I read last year, French book by a leading noir French author called Le Petit Bleu de la Côte Ouest by Jean-Patrick Manchette, where a man who is being pursued by mysterious individuals who may or may not be government agents or criminals or whatever, goes on the run for an extended amount of time and leaves everything behind, and goes to live in a cabin and redoes his life in the cabin, and literally years go by. And I love this in here. There is this dynamic propulsion towards going on the lam. And it's noir, and it's Kafka, and it's what Kafka would have written today if Kafka were alive. He would have written about a man diving for a plane, but the plane's not really a plane, or is it there? Who knows? And who are these mysterious people after him? So I just loved that. I thought that was so cool. Now, a quick word on the second book, STELLA, which is unfortunately much weaker. It's not a disaster. It's okay, it's pretty good, but it's much weaker than the very powerful, versatile beast that is The Passenger, where you're going in all these different places. You're in race car driving and physics, and a brother loving his sister, and you've got these schizophrenic gangs everywhere, and it's just amazing, and just different points of view and all sorts of different vibes happening. It's so cool. The second book is not at all like this. The second book is essentially one long dialogue across multiple sessions of psychotherapy between the sister, Alicia, who is paranoid schizophrenic, and her psychotherapist. And so you're not moving around. You're stuck in this hospital. You are in a discussion with her. It turns out, more clearly in this second book, is a genius, is very advanced mentally, and capable of all sorts of genius feats, such as being a really deep mathematician. It looks more closely at her life. I didn't love the character as much. I thought it was a weaker character. Yes, the character is ill, but was quite abrasive, at least at the beginning. As the second novel progresses, the character becomes more sympathetic as we understand her better. But overall, it's a lot weaker. And another sin that it commits is that it is a little bit of an exposition in parts for bits that were deliciously mysterious in The Passenger, which are then revealed much more clearly, much more literally in the second book. Look here, if you didn't understand what this person was about in the first book, well, I'm explaining it to you better now. And all that subtlety that was in The Passenger is sort of bared open in a way that's not as subtle and so less fun. But it's not, again, it's not a disaster. It's just weaker, and it doesn't serve much purpose. And it is skippable. I actually think The Passenger should come with a health warning saying, you know what, you don't really need to read Stella Maris. I don't think. I think the Passenger stands perfectly well on its own, whereas Stella Maris cannot stand on its own. It cannot stand independently. It's too weak a novel for that. It has to be seen and read and understood in relation to the first novel. Many people will probably disagree with that and say, oh, Stella Maris, yeah, absolutely, it could stand it on its own novel. On its own, I disagree. I think on its own, it would just be meaningless and uninteresting, and essentially a dialogue between a mentally ill woman and her psychotherapist, and it just doesn't really make sense. Another thing that I loved about the race car driving, and again, it's a question of vibes, was yes, he drove this amazing car, the Maserati Bora, but the way it's described and the way he thinks about it transported me to those great movies of the 70s around race car driving. And I'm thinking of the movie Le Mans with Steve McQueen, who's such a dude, such a man. And, you know, you sort of picture Bobby Western in a Steve McQueen sort of vibe. There's a even better movie connected to like 1970s race car driving in Europe and all the glamour, but with a lot of depth and a lot of punch, which is the movie Bobby Deerfield with Al Pacino. Here's a poster of it. And here's Al Pacino in the movie. God damn, that looks so glamorous with that martini sign and everything. I mean, it's just so cool. So I just loved that vibe. And so imagine, you know, this guy in the cockpit of a race car, but also thinking about nuclear explosions and the violence of man upon man. And I mean, you know, the depth of it is just staggering. Another point I'd love to talk about in this rant is the movie, the title, The Passenger, which is obviously a great reference and homage to the 1975 movie, I believe, by Michelangelo Antonioni, the Italian film director. The movie is called The Passenger with Jack Nicholson. And it's the story of a guy in a nameless African country who decides for some reason or another to take on the identity of a dead man and goes along for the ride. But it turns out the dead man was, I think, an arms dealer. I haven't seen the movie in years, but there's that whole aura of mystery. Nothing is as it seems. It's very contemplative. Jack Nicholson is just a passenger in this other life. And that's sort of something that you're seeing here. There's something very contemplative about it. Another thing that I thought was really very cool, and this is a big spoiler, so I'm gonna put a big spoiler alert. At one point in the book, Bobby Western has a conversation during a walk, or has a visitation perhaps, with the kid, who is his sister's main hallucination, main tormentor in her head, the main creator of her paranoia. And this kid makes an appearance in Bobby Western's life as a hallucination or as a mental conversation or whatever. And they have a discussion around the sister. And I just thought that was so powerful, that this embodiment of the illness, of this evil illness, and this is an evil embodiment of this evil illness, makes a transition into the mind of someone else and has a dialogue there. I mean, that I just thought that was so brilliant and so amazing, that Bobby Western was able to imagine that conversation and make it happen. And did the conversation happen or not, or is it an imagination? Who knows? And frankly, who fucking cares? Because to me, that evoked, again, another movie. It's a sort of a David Lynch element, very much like a Lost Highway thing, where that character comes up to Bill Pullman in the movie and is like, I'm at your house right now. And that's what's happening. It's like, I'm in your sister's head, but I'm talking to you. And they go for a walk on the beach and they talk about, what's involved here? What are we doing? And what are you doing to my sister? And it's just an amazing way of framing that discussion. I thought that was just heartbreaking and beautiful and just astounding. And I loved it. So that was absolutely phenomenal. Overall, you can see all these points that I'm making that are connected or not connected, or I don't know. You're talking about English philosophy in the 16th century, 17th century, and race car driving and nuclear physics and paranoid schizophrenia and the way it's depicted, and the ultimate villain of the story is paranoid schizophrenia, or this relationship between brother and sister, and so much is touched upon, and since this orb of life, because that's what life is. There's not a story. I'm not going through my day thinking, okay, act 1 and then maybe act 2, this is going to develop. No, there's going to be other stuff that comes into the story of my life or your life, and all these bits are going to add up to a vibe. And so it's not a plot, it's a vibe. It's just one big vibe, and the big vibe is, am I a passenger in my life, and is this world nasty, brutish, and short? And what do I remember from my days as a race car driver, aside from the fact that I'm driving a Maserati? And all these things were just so cool. And so I kept turning pages in this book and thinking, damn, this is so cool. This guy is so cool. Everything's so cool. And so I just loved it. And you can't think of this book in a literal way. You can't think to yourself, well, what was the plane about? Or what was the thing? And I think this is the difference. I asked myself afterwards, what was the difference between this, where I was extremely tolerant of stuff not going anywhere, and Murakami, who I really have a problem with as an author, because Murakami sets up so much stuff in his books that goes nowhere. And it always pisses me off when I read Murakami. I'm like, oh, for crying out loud, why is the cat talking? And like, why is this restaurant, jazz restaurant, the place where all the spirits meet or whatever? And it really pisses me off when I read Murakami. And here I was much more tolerant of it. And I think it's because you get the sense that, Cormac McCarthy is not making promises about anything. He's just presenting it. You engage with it in whatever way you like. If you don't like it, just don't worry, move on, and don't take it so literally. Whereas Murakami, you feel, sets up these things as a device to keep you a little bit hooked. He's hooking you by asking all these questions that you're like, what? I don't understand how this is happening. I need to know, like, why, how this is driving that. What is this? Like, is there a portal that's connecting these two things? Or is this person transforming into the ghost of that person or whatever? And so you're sort of hooked in that way. And I find that quite cheap and irritating. Here, there's no sense that you're being promised a rational ending. You're plunged in a thing, and it's quite clear, I thought, maybe many of you will disagree, but it's quite clear that, hey, this is probably not going to go anywhere. Don't worry about it. Just move on. Go to the next thing. The next thing's equally cool. You'll see. And so, I think I'm sort of ranted out now. I've gone on too long. If any of you have listened to this until the end, I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. I just had to get all of this off my chest because I thought it was so goddamn cool. I'm not even sure I'm done talking about it. Maybe I'll organize like a fan club of this book, and we'll do like a Zoom call, and you know, and we'll talk about it on this Zoom call. And so if you've watched this far and you think this sort of Zoom call idea might be a good idea, leave me a note in the comments and just tell me, yeah, let's do a Zoom call. And if I get like 5 or 6, we'll do a Zoom call and we'll just chat about this book for hours and compare notes and read passages to each other and just admire Cormac McCarthy, and it would just be epic. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, let me know, write in the comments, tell your friends and family, and I hope you're all reading some great books. Let me know if you read this one, what you thought about it. You know, let's have a conversation around it. And wishing you all the very best. And in the meantime, keep reading. Thanks a lot. Bye.